Colossians 1:7, just as you learned it from Epaphras, our beloved fellow servant. He is a faithful minister of Christ on your behalf. So remember where we are. He's talked about the grace of God in the gospel is bearing fruit and increasing in the whole world, and it's come to them where they heard and they understood, assuming that they believed the gospel. They responded appropriately to the gospel. Now, they learned it. They learned it from whom? From Epaphras. Now remember, Paul and Timothy have never been to Colossae. They're hearing this from Epaphras, and we're to assume here that Epaphras is the one who first preached the gospel to them. Epaphras is the one who has converted these people to faith in Jesus. We think that from later on in chapter 4, we think that Epaphras is a native of Colossae, and the Epaphras has preached the gospel to them. And look at how he describes him. He calls him our beloved fellow servant. Now, this is from a Greek word that means a slave. You guys have probably heard people talk about doulos as a slave, and this is someone who is a fellow slave, that he is a fellow slave, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, of the gospel. And then he goes on and says that he is our beloved fellow servant, he's our fellow bondservant, and he's also a faithful minister of Christ on their behalf. So he is a faithful minister. This word minister is a term. This actually comes from the Greek word that we get the word deacon from. And this is good for us to understand that deacon, it means someone who is a servant, someone who is a minister. And so he is a servant of Christ, and not just a servant of Christ, but he's a faithful servant of Christ. We know that because he's being faithful to preach the gospel to those in Colossae. So he is a faithful minister of Christ, and he is faithful to Jesus, but he's also faithful to the Colossians, that he is a minister on their behalf, that the ministry that God has called Epaphras to is to preach the gospel, the word of truth, the grace of God in truth to those at Colossae, call them to repentance, which is what they've done. And in so doing, he is proving himself to be a beloved, he's loved by them, a beloved fellow bond servant and slave. He's also a faithful servant of Christ on their behalf.